Last time we spoke about the blitzkrieg in Western Europe. In 1939, Europe teetered on the brink of war as tensions surged following the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Stalin and Hitler, which divided Eastern Europe. With fierce ambition, Germany initiated its blitzkrieg strategy, invading Poland swiftly and decisively. In a mere 35 days, Polish defenses crumbled under overwhelming German might. Following Poland's fall, Hitler's forces turned to Denmark and Norway, capturing these territories with remarkable speed, establishing German dominance in Scandinavia. The focus then shifted westward as Belgium and the Netherlands were quickly overrun, leading to the rapid collapse of the French defenses. By June 14th of 1940, the Germans stormed Paris, signaling the end of France's defenses. The sequence of events unfolded with shocking speed, causing global astonishment. The Blitzkrieg campaign established Germany as a formidable force, setting the stage for a conflict that would engulf the world and dramatically alter its landscape. This episode is Prelude number 10, Planning Operation Barbarossa. Well, hello there again. Welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you consider checking out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just released an episode covering Japan's government by assassination period. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Well, hello again. Today we are edging ever closer to the beginning of the Eastern Front. Following the disastrous Winter War with Finland, Stalin aimed to reorganize the Red Army. Fresh from the purges, he also opted for a reshuffling of leadership. While tensions ran high, very few, if any, leaders in the Red Army faced purges due to the outcomes of the Winter War. By February of 1940, General of the Army Zhukov was summoned to Moscow to assume the role as Chief of the General Staff. Now, Zhukov was a towering figure in this series, so why not go through a short bio on him? Zhukov was born into a struggling peasant family of Russian descent in Strelkovka, located in Malaya-Skalsky, a district of the Kula Governorate in western Russia. It's about 62 miles east of Moscow. His father, Konstantin, who was orphaned at the age of 2 and later adopted by Anushka Zhukova, worked as a cobbler. His mother, Ustinya, was a peasant laborer. Zhukov was believed to have taken after his mother, claiming he inherited her physical strength. Ustinya was reportedly capable of handling tough tasks, such as transporting 200-pound sacks of grain over long distances. So many Soviet jokes to make there. At a time when most individuals from the lower and working classes in Russia received only 2 years of education, Zhukov completed a 3-year primary schooling at his local school. He later became an apprentice to his uncle, Mikhail, in Moscow, learning the furrer trades. While working with his uncle, Zhukov enhanced his education by reading various subjects, including the Russian and German languages, science, geography, and mathematics, alongside his cousin Alexander. He also enrolled in night school, completing courses as time allowed while working in his uncle's shop. By 1914, he finished his apprenticeship and he started his own fur business, employing 3 young workers. In 1915, Zhukov was drafted into the Imperial Russian Army, serving in the 10th Dragoon Novgorod Regiment, where he was wounded during combat against the Germans at Kharkov. Throughout World War I, he was awarded the Cross of St. George twice for his bravery, and he was promoted to non-commissioned officer ranks due to his valor in battle. After the October Revolution of 1917, he joined the Bolsheviks, where his background of poverty served as an advantage in the party circles. Following a severe bout of typhus, he participated in the Russian Civil War, serving in the 2nd Cavalry Brigade under Commander Semyon Timoshenko, which was later incorporated into the 1st Cavalry Army, led by Semyon Budoyny. In 1920, he completed a cavalry officer training course and he received his commission as an officer. In recognition of his role in suppressing the Tambov Rebellion in 1921, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Zhukov rapidly progressed through the ranks, becoming the commander of a cavalry troop and a squadron, then the deputy commander of a cavalry regiment. By late May of 1923, he was appointed as the commander of the 39th Cavalry Regiment. The following year, he entered the Higher School of Cavalry and graduated in 1924, after which he returned to command the same regiment. According to Friedrich von Malenthin, it is not generally realized that Zhukov received much of his early training in Germany, together with other Russian officers and by arrangement from the Reichswehr. He attended courses at German military schools in the 1920s. He spent some time attached to a cavalry regiment under Colonel Dingla, who vividly recalled Zhukov's boisterous behavior and the large amounts of liquor he and his comrades consumed after dinner. Nevertheless, it is evident that Zhukov made good use of his time in the military training. Zhukov attended the Freund's Military Academy from 1929 until his graduation in 1930. In May of 1930, he became the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade of the 7th Cavalry Division. By February of 1931, he was appointed as the Assistant Inspector of Cavalry for the Red Army. In May of 1933, Zhukov became the commander of the 4th Cavalry Division. During the Great Purge, when thousands of officers were arrested and executed, Zhukov and those associated with the 1st Cavalry Army were spared, as they were involved in conflicts with the Japanese near Manchuria. By 1937, he commanded the 3rd Cavalry Corps and later the 6th Cavalry Corps. In 1938, he was appointed as the Deputy Cavalry Commander of the Belarusian Military District. Later in 1938, Zhukov was assigned to lead the 1st Soviet Mongolian People's Army, engaging in combat against Japan's Kwangtung Army along the border of the Mongolian People's Republic and the Japanese-held state of Manchukuo. The Soviet-Japanese border clashes lasted from 1938 to 1939. What started as a border skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale war, with the Japanese advancing with around 80,000 troops, 180 tanks, and 450 aircraft. This escalation led to a crucial battle known as the Battle of Kalkhin Gol. Zhukov called for significant reinforcements, and on August 20th of 1939, his Soviet counteroffensive commenced. Following a substantial artillery barrage, nearly 500 BT-5s and BT-7 tanks advanced, backed by over 500 fighters and bombers, marking the Soviet Air Force's first fighter-bomber operation. Initially, the offensive seemed like a standard frontal assault. However, Zhukov executed a pincer movement, a classic cavalry strategy holding back 2 tank brigades before ordering them to advance around both flanks, supported by motorized artillery, infantry, and other tanks. This bold maneuver successfully encircled the Japanese Sixth Army and captured their vulnerable supply lines. By August 31st, the Japanese forces were expelled from the contested border area, resulting in a clear Soviet victory. This campaign held importance beyond its immediate tactical and local consequences. Zhukov tested and refined techniques that would later be employed against the Germans on the Eastern Front during World War II. His innovative tactics included using underwater bridges and enhancing the cohesion and effectiveness of inexperienced units by integrating a handful of seasoned veterans to improve morale and overall training. His assessments of the issues faced by the BT tanks led to replacements of their flammable gasoline engines with diesel engines. The battle provided critical insights that contributed to the successful development of the T-34 medium tank that would be utilized in World War II, famously. Following this campaign, veterans were systematically reassigned to newer units to disseminate their combat experience. For his great success, Zhukov was honored as Hero of the Soviet Union. However, the campaign, and particularly Zhukov's groundbreaking tank strategies, remained relatively unknown outside of the Soviet Union. Zhukov came to view the Battle of Kalkhin Gol as crucial for the preparation for future operations that would be needed against the Germans. By May of 1940, he attained the rank of Army General, becoming one of only 8 senior Red Army officers. Upon taking command, a comprehensive reorganization of the country's defensive forces was initiated. There is some debate regarding how much of this restructuring was Zhukov's idea, but he demonstrated the same level of competence in his new position as he had in the field. The army in the western region of the country was divided into 5 specialized military districts, which were designed to create defensive fronts to withstand any invasion while the primary forces were mobilized. These districts were based in Leningrad, Riga, Minsk, Kiev, and Odessa, respectively becoming known as the Northern, Northwestern, Western, Southwestern, and Southern Fronts. Essentially, these were provisional staff organizations that would be supplemented with mobilized units as determined by the Stavka. At the time, it was widely recognized that the upper echelons of the army's command structure had been profoundly impacted by the purges. However, what remained unclear was the fate of the mid-level officers responsible for leading the divisions and regiments of the Red Army in 1941. These individuals were generally younger than their counterparts in the Wehrmacht, and in many instances, divisional commanders lacked any formal military training. To complicate matters, many of these officers had very little time to prepare their troops. Developing skilled tactical leaders requires time, and experience must be acquired through the operation of units. Effective maneuvers needed to be planned and executed on training grounds to educate officers on the principles of division-level combat. Regrettably for the Red Army, this crucial experience would have to be gained in the theater of war. Post-World War II literature kind of frowned upon the Red Army leaders' use of human wave tactics. This is only partially a legitimate criticism. Such wasteful tactics certainly happened, but they were primarily due to the poor state of command and control. Division corps and even some army commanders had no experience in maneuvering large units in battle. Even when they did, the desperate strategic situation was often such as there was no choice but to conduct large-scale frontal assaults on well-prepared German positions. As the war progressed, officers of all ranks gained valuable experience in tactical movement. Additionally, the strategic situation improved slowly. This allowed for assaults to be well supported with artillery, armor, and air. By 1945, human waves were a relic of the past. Combat was still bloody, but it was not as desperate as the battles of 1941. The country's defenses against a threat from the West was structured into strategic layers. There were 2 layers of the regular army and a forward defensive element at the border. This border defense comprised the NKVD border guard detachments and regular soldiers stationed in fortified regions. These troops were responsible for constructing, enhancing, and manning the fortifications along the USSR's border. By June of 1941, there were 57 fortified regions and 42 located in the West, totaling 190,000 personnel. The NKVD border guards had around 165,000 members across these various units and detachments. The goal for these forces was to resist any invasion while the rest of the army mobilized and positioned themselves for counteroffensives. If that failed, they would create a substantial obstacle to slow the enemy down. However, their location near the border required them to be ready before any invasion attempt to effectively delay or repel the enemy. Unfortunately, this objective was not achievable on the day of Operation Barbarossa, as Stalin's late order to prepare the troops did not allow for sufficient time for them to take their positions. Lastly, the NKVD Railroad Security Forces, consisting of approximately 62,000 men, were deployed around the country's railroad depots, bridges, and other key logistical areas. The country's defense against a Western threat were structured into strategic levels. It consisted of 2 strategic echelons of the regular army and a forward border defense unit. As we had mentioned, this border defense was formed by the NKVD border guard detachments and regular soldiers stationed in the fortified regions. The NKVD border guard detachments were independent units who were armed and equipped as light infantry, but they fell under the umbrella of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or NKVD. This was in opposition to the Red Army's fortified regions, which were division-sized elements intended to be able to build and man bunkers along the border. Both types of units were emplaced along the border to a depth of approximately 20 kilometers. These troops were responsible for constructing, enhancing, and staffing the fortifications along the USSR borders. On June the 22nd of 1941, the fortified regions only had 47% of their men and 27% of their officers. Around 50% of the authorized fortifications had not been built. This was combined with late authorization to go over full alert from Moscow, spelling absolute disaster for the defense of the border. The subsequent line of defense is often called the First Strategic Echelon, comprising the initial standalone units of the Red Army. This force consisted of 15 field armies divided into 5 fronts mentioned earlier, totaling 166 divisions. On the northern front, the 7th, 14th, and 23rd Armies comprised 22 divisions, supported by reserves including 3 independent rifle divisions and a motorized corps. They were positioned along the Soviet-Finnish border, extending from Leningrad to the Barents Sea. The northwestern front, covering the areas of the former Baltic republics, had 3 field armies available. The 27th Army was in reserve around the Ostov area, alongside the 5th Airborne Corps, while the 8th and 11th Armies were stationed along the front that faced German East Prussia down to Vilnius. Together, these forces totaled 29 divisions. The Western Front consisted of 4 armies, 3 of which were positioned along the border with the German-occupied Poland. The 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies were deployed near the border, with the 13th Army held in reserve further behind the lines near Minsk. Overall, this front included reserves, had 43 divisions. The Southwestern Front was the largest of the Red Army's formations. The 5th, 6th, 12th, and 26th Armies were deployed along the front, supported by substantial reserves situated behind them. With 4 rifle divisions, 2 motorized divisions, and an airborne corps, the Southwestern Front possessed considerable strength that could create secondary lines to safeguard the retreat of its forces, a luxury that none of its counterparts would enjoy during the initial days of Barbarossa. The Southern Front was the smallest, comprising just 1 field army. Its 14 divisions were stationed along the Romanian border near the port of Odessa. In contrast, the 9th Army was considerably larger than its northern counterparts, partly because of the extensive area it needed to cover. The region was also not perceived as a probable zone of operations. Numerous sources can be quite vague on this point, but it's possible that Stalin did not anticipate the Romanians would actively engage the Soviet Union. That is probably because of what happened during World War I. But it is clear that Germany had become the dominant political force in internal Romanian politics by this point. Stalin was under no illusion of this. It had been one of the flaring points in the rising tensions between Germany and the Soviet Union, after all. Bessarabia had been occupied in June of 1940. The German campaigns in the Balkans and Greece were seen as counterweights to Soviet influence in the region. Behind these field armies, the Stavka Reserve was positioned in the 2nd Strategic Echelon, consisting of 57 divisions spread across 6 field armies. 3 of these armies, the 19th, 21st, and 22nd, were stationed west of Moscow, each positioned behind one of the main fronts. The 20th Army was located near the capital, while the 16th and 24th Armies were stationed in Siberia, based in Chita. They were set to advance westward eventually, but for now they served to maintain the Red Army's presence along the lengthy stretch of the Soviet Union, linking the Far Eastern Front to the capital. In this development framework, plans were crafted for the country's defense. The armies in the 1st Strategic Echelon were expected to bear the primary impact of the enemy invasion. Aiming to strengthen the border guards and occupy the defensive positions along the border, they would require time to mobilize. Within this echelon, the initial operational reserve was designated to be the main component of the Red Army's counterattack capability. Within this context, an operational reserve can be distinguished from a strategic reserve. The first type are units that may be fed into the battle, usually piecemeal to shorten up weakened defenses or to help carry forward or struggling attacks. Units in the strategic reserve are typically used as a block in order to build a counteroffensive capability on a wide scale. Any breaches in the border defenses would be managed by these forces. While the Red Army's strategy focused on creating substantial counterattacks to strike back at the invaders utilizing the Stavka Reserve. Now, after France's defeat, it became clear that a war with Germany and its allies was unavoidable. Following some discussions, the consensus emerged that the most probable approach would involve fighting on 2 fronts. Germany and its European partners would launch attacks in the west, while Japan would aggressively target the armies in the Far East. Although plans were frequently adjusted, the overarching strategy was to ensure that the border forces could effectively hold off the invaders while the majority of the Red Army was mobilized and positioned for a major counteroffensive in the west. This operation was primarily envisioned to come from the southwestern front, advancing northwest towards Lublin, continuing to Lodz, and ultimately reaching Danzig. Such a daring maneuver aimed to isolate the enemy along the border. Throughout the later half of 1940, discussions persisted regarding the focal point of the German offensive. In October, Stalin asserted his belief that the Germans would primarily target Ukraine and its rich natural resources. Ironically, during the same time period, Hitler was struggling with his general staff about where the main effort should be focused. No explicit agreement was reached beyond the destruction of the Red Army being the first priority. This indecision would come to haunt the Wehrmacht's war effort throughout 1941. Hitler eventually decided that Ukraine would be the first priority, but only after months of indecisive combat had drained the resources of the Wehrmacht. Despite the challenges, the Soviet Union began implementing several defensive measures. A significant portion of their efforts focused on expanding industrial capabilities to produce equipment and ammunition. They placed substantial orders for large quantities of the latest tank models, such as the T-34 and the KV-1. While it would take some time for these tanks to reach frontline units in sufficient quantities, it was absolutely crucial to establish production capacity as soon as possible. This urgency stemmed partly from the Soviet Union's ongoing shortages of machinery necessary for mass weapon and ammunition production. While Stalin sought to gain favor with Hitler by increasing exports to Germany, Hitler was reducing deliveries to the Soviet Union. To address this gap, Stalin placed extensive orders for machinery at German factories, highlighting the long way the Soviet Union had gone to establish a robust industrial base for protracted conflict. By the summer of 1941, it was well understood amongst the top leadership that the production capacity was inadequate. There was a significant shortfall of anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, and even modern field artillery, and ammunition for these weapons was also being produced in insufficient quantities. In addition to the fundamental reorganization of the frontier into designated areas of responsibility, there was the requirement for a thorough overhaul of the Red Army's order of battle. The independent tank units had been suspended some time after the invasion of Poland, and following the observation of the German campaigns in the West, the Stavka recognized the error of this decision. They began to reinstate these units, founding tank divisions and mechanized corps that were included into the Red Army's organizational structure. However, these formations were fundamentally different from the German concept of Panzergroups, which were designated for strategic objectives like breakthroughs and subsequent encirclements. The classic example of this was the 1940 campaign in France in the Low Countries. Infantry units held down the bulk of the enemy army, and the panzers selected a strategic weak point, orchestrated a breakthrough, and then conducted a sweeping envelopment, cutting off the enemy's line of retreat. In contrast, Soviet tank units were allocated to individual field armies for localized breakthrough operations and counterattacks. While the Red Army's doctrine would later evolve, it remained relatively rudimentary in 1941. These reformed units were essentially being built from the ground up, a process that required considerable time, resources, and personnel. Many of the tank divisions were significantly under strength on June the 22nd of 1941. Although exact figures for each unit are pretty difficult to ascertain, 3 divisions serve as a broadly representative example of the Red Army as a whole. The tank divisions were critically lacking in modern equipment that they were supposed to possess. For instance, the 1st Tank Division had less than 10% of its authorized 62 kV-1 heavy tanks, while the medium tank battalions fared no better, with only 38% of their authorized strength of 206 T-34 tanks. The failure to adequately equip these divisions with modern tanks was further exacerbated by the presence of obsolete tanks, creating a misleading impression of strength that would later trouble commanders in the early months of the campaign. Overall, there were 40 tank divisions in the Western Theater. To achieve full authorization strength, 8,240 T-34s and 2,408 KV-1s were needed. However, by June, 967 T-34s and 508 KV-1s had been delivered. Across the theater, the Red Army managed to acquire just 11% of the required medium tanks and 20% of the necessary heavy tanks. The tank arm was not the only aspect of the Red Army that faced significant issues in the final days of peace. In the early 1940s, the standard structure of rifle divisions was modified to a more streamlined format. This change was partly because tanks were removed from their role as infantry support, where they had previously been included in the infantry division. This is similar to the French model, where infantry divisions had organic medium and heavy tank elements that would support the infantry division's breakthroughs. This was another theory of armor employment that was born out of experience of the First World War. It proved to be quite an inferior model in many respects to the German theory of massed armored formations conducting breakthroughs on their own accord. The Red Army's leadership was merely following the trends of theory of development as they saw it. And they were not alone. The U.S. Army was also continuing their development of their concept of armor employment in response to the German successes in Western Europe. For example, at the head of this was actually one famous general named Patton. However, this reduction in divisional size on paper did not reflect the actual strength of the units in the field. Some rifle divisions deployed in the Western Theater were so undermanned, they bordered an absurdity. The peacetime personnel levels of the Red Army were set by the Stavka, following decisions made by the NKO regarding readiness measures. The NKO is the Soviet Union's equivalent to the modern U.S. Department of Defense. Stavka was the military high command, but they ultimately reported to the NKO head, called the People's Commissar for the Defense of the Soviet Union. In June of 1941, this position was held by Marshal of the Soviet Union, Timoshenko. After the invasion began, he was also named the chairman of the Stavka, but eventually gave both of these positions to Stalin. These strengths were periodically reviewed, fluctuating up or down, but they never reached the full mobilization strength of approximately 14,500 soldiers. By June of 1941, the authorized strength had risen to as high as 85%. While this represented quite a lot of progress, not all divisions achieved this level. Some divisions were recorded as having less than 42% of their authorized personnel, and this figure was further diminished by the absences due to leave, illness, or desertion. Now, the Red Air Force faced significant challenges in its efforts to rebuild and redeploy in the West based on the new strategic framework. Drawing lessons from the Winter War and the Spanish Civil War, the Red Air Force revised its main mission objectives. Prior to these conflicts, the emphasis had been on long-range bombing aimed at destroying enemy airfields and industrial facilities. However, the updated strategies prioritized tactical air superiority and close air support over such missions. This shift was a logical decision, one that absolutely resonated with air forces globally. Nonetheless, difficulties emerged with the strategies implemented to achieve these new objectives. The Air Force was organized into regiments, with aircraft assigned to front and army commanders, allowing them to deploy the planes as they preferred. In practice, this led to widespread dispersion of Red Air Forces to satisfy local commanders' needs. Consequently, smaller frontier airfields became overcrowded with aircraft due to command and control complications. This overcrowding resulted in many planes being stationed far too close to the border, lacking the space and time necessary to respond effectively to German air formations. As a result, thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the early days of Operation Barbarossa, completely caught off guard by the surprise attacks. The pride of the Soviet military was on the brink of being systematically eliminated. In addition to these placement issues, the Red Air Force also struggled with modernization, as insufficient industrial capacity had been allocated for the production and delivery of advanced aircraft required. The mobilization plans were not fully realized when the Germans launched their invasion, and actual implementation was even less developed. The fundamental flaw in the Red Army's mobilization strategy was its reliance on the assumption that they would receive advance warning before such an attack. In retrospect, this assumption seems absolutely absurd and outdated. The slow-moving armies of World War I had adhered to lengthy mobilization timelines that often took weeks or even months. However, given the context of that time, it was not unreasonable to believe that the Red Army would have sufficient time for mobilization. The unmistakable signs of the German Army's mobilization and deployment in 1939 were evident to just about everybody. The Poles were unprepared, largely due to internal indecision and external pressures from the British and French, that mobilization of the Polish army would give the Germans a reason to invade. This proved to be senseless hesitancy on their part, and it would cost the Poles their entire country. Appeasing Hitler, even in the short term, did not stay his hand. Stalin would have learnt this lesson for himself even after watching it happen many, many times before. By 1940, the only uncertainty was about where the main thrust of the Wehrmacht would be, not whether they had prepared and mobilized. Much of this uncertainty stemmed from the density of their deployments, allowing forces in one location to strike in various directions. The Red Army was justified in expecting a warning to facilitate mobilization. In fact, they received ample warnings. What was missing was the authorization to mobilize, which would have to come from Stalin himself. It was unpredictable that Stalin would hesitate and issue orders against mobilizing when every indicator suggested otherwise. Frontline intelligence signaled to Stavka, and covert sources within the Soviet Union indicated an impending attack. Both the British and the Americans provided warnings concerning Germany's intentions. In early 1941, the American government informed the Soviet ambassador that Germany was definitely planning an invasion of the Soviet Union that spring. The British also communicated that they were aware of Germany's invasion plans. Stalin chose to ignore these alerts. Even in April, despite firm warnings from the British government that Hitler was preparing to invade, Stalin remained dismissive. The British government was not fazed by Stalin's refusal to see the truth and continued to regularly warn his government of the attack. As late as June 18th, they had told the Soviet ambassador that the German attack was inevitable, and it would come no later than the middle of June. Only 3 days would pass before they were proven right. Stalin routinely characterized these alerts as English provocations and clumsy fabrications. This decision-making failure, rather than a lack of warning, spelled absolute doom for the Red Army. While discussions of tactical and strategic surprise are common in any analysis of the invasion's early days, they are often overstated. Many individual units were not in position because they were not permitted to deploy. They were not fully staffed because, in many instances, mobilization had not been authorized. Soldiers cannot simply appear when requested by colonels or generals. They must be summoned from their civilian lives, organized, and assigned to their units. These responsibilities fall to the highest levels of any bureaucracy. In the Soviet Union, as in many countries, such decisions were made by the top authorities. Joseph Stalin chose to restrain his own army, and they ultimately paid the consequences of that very bad decision. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history-related content, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Joseph Stalin watched in absolute horror as the Germans conquered most of Western Europe in a lightning-fast sweep. All Stalin could do was speed up the training and military production of the USSR, hoping he could bide enough time to meet the enormous threat that was emerging to his west. Despite basically every single person warning him, he was not prepared for the storm that was coming.